ARE Podcast, episode number 29.
Welcome to the ARE Podcast. ARE Podcast, where it's all about encouraging and inspiring you today so you can fulfill your dream of becoming a licensed architect tomorrow. And now your host, David Doucette.
Hello, and welcome to episode number 29 of the ARE Podcast. Once again, as always, joined by our co-host, Eric Corey Freed.
Hi.
All right, we got a page-turner of an episode today, actually, called Healthy Buildings and Transparency, and Eric's been on a little bit of a research kick lately, and this stuff is important. It's very relevant, not always talked about, especially in architecture school, but as a societal problem or a societal issue, it's extremely important, so we're going to talk about that today. Where do you want to begin, Eric?
Well, I kind of want to begin just with this overview of where we are. So I want to kind of give you just a quick 3-minute history lesson, which will kind of get you into my mindset right now, which is pretty damaged.
Because you watched like what, 5 documentaries this weekend? I
made the mistake of watching 5 really depressing documentaries on toxins and health this weekend all in a row, and it kind of messed me up. But I've been working with healthy buildings for 25 years, starting with clients coming to me saying that they have multiple chemical sensitivities and wanting to really question everything that goes in the buildings. And that kind of, that started me asking questions of material suppliers and vendors that they didn't know the answers to. And the interesting thing about materials is that materials have transformed the world throughout history. If you think about what stone did for the ancient Egyptians and their pyramids, if you think about how steel was then forged into swords, which created armies, and how that expanded humanity, and then even on a less violent turn, how steel was crafted into girders for growing upward into skyscrapers. If you think about, let's say, Chicago at the turn of the century, or even how dimensional lumber and mass production of materials allowed for expansion and post-World War II growth in America, and how that turned into our vision of success in the American dream. So materials have changed the world, whether we like to realize it or not. But then after all of that, right around 1950s, we entered an age called the petrochemical age. The petrochemical industry took off, essentially. And we realized that we had cheap oil bubbling out of the ground, and we could make this oil into almost anything we wanted to. And we could start to get aspects of things. If we wanted it more waterproof, we could just play with the molecules a little bit. If we wanted it more bendy, we could play with the molecules. And this spawned a chemical revolution, but it also then kicked off a toxins revolution at the same time.
Well, let me just stop you for a second. So let's say prior to 1950, obviously they were working with materials, combining them to make steel girders and such. But it sounds like primarily from 1950 to sort of the beginning of man, materials were sort of much more a natural element. They were much closer to their source. Even I guess when we made steel, I'm assuming a lot of the steel stuff, there was a lot of natural elements to sort of the steel girders. It wasn't like the chemical revolution. Well,
the steel was just raw ore that was melted into steel. We didn't treat it with chromium the way we do today. We didn't have the alloys that we mix all these chemicals in with the steel like we do today. It was just raw steel. So in the healthy buildings world, whenever we look at older buildings, typically the older ones are fairly healthy, and you look at the successive renovations that were done from the 1950s forward as the trouble areas, because the 1950s is when they introduced lead paint, asbestos, formaldehyde, and all these toxins. But if you had an old building that was, let's say, untouched, here's what's amazing about it. It's all just wood
right.
and stuff. It's just stone and stuff. And the older the building is, ironically, the healthier it is. And even more so, the more likely it is to not be dependent on energy, because back then they oriented the buildings to the sun They designed them for fresh air, so the windows opened. Think about like an old city hall built in the 1880s or something in your town. And it's probably a much greener and much healthier building, ironically, than a new building built today that's just swarming with toxins and dependent on fossil fuels.
It's actually fascinating. I've never really considered that before, but if we think about prior to 1950, and it's interesting, 1950 is, or thereabouts, is when things really turn, because if you think, we go back to the 1850s or wherever we go back to, people aren't complaining about getting headaches from the wood floor that is in their house. I mean, it's natural. There's not a bunch of crap on it. But right now, in order for us to develop and serve more people in this society on this planet, we have now chemically altered our buildings, essentially. Well, also our food. I would imagine our food sort of chemical play probably started around that time too.
It did, and to a scientist, it was an exciting period. Do you remember that film, The Graduate, with Dustin Hoffman?
Yeah. And
there's that famous scene where the dad's friend pulls him out by the pool and said, "Benjamin, I've got one word for you: plastics."
Right.
And that was the idea, that plastics were going to transform the world, and they did. They really did. The wealth of innovations and progress we've had based on this petrochemical industry have been remarkable, but at the same time, we've paid a price in toxifying ourselves throughout it.
It's interesting, and it's not just toxifying ourselves through the buildings, which is what we're talking about today, but it's through food. It's through a lot of things, because let's face it, chemicals are pretty much in just about anything that we can think of, or anything that we use on a daily basis has some sort of chemical added to it, including our food.
And it's not just, there's huge ones in food, but think about your toothpaste, your shampoo, your hand lotion, your face cream, right? The average female uses about at least 10 different products a day, and they're all just pure chemical mixtures. And the worst part is that these companies have no regulation upon them, especially in the U.S., to disclose what's in them. So there's no transparency as to what's actually in this product. And oftentimes they'll use code words. So if you pick up a bottle of shampoo in your house and read the label, the first ingredient will probably be water, because that's the heaviest ingredient by weight. But all the other things will be chemicals you can't even pronounce.
Right.
And so you have no idea what they are. And then what's worse is that there's a whole category of chemicals called fragrance, which is really could be anywhere from 1,000 different chemicals that are just labeled fragrance, that are known endocrine disruptors, known phthalates, known carcinogens, that will essentially is the reason for the uptake in cancer, Alzheimer's, and all the other kind of terrible diseases we have.
And the issue is, not only is this stuff in our shampoo and elsewhere, it's in our building materials, and it's in our buildings, and creating these unhealthy buildings.
Yeah, but I could go to your house, I could open up your kitchen or bathroom cabinets and say, okay, all these chemicals, they got to go. And we could, instantly put you on a path to buying healthier, consumable products. But your buildings, it's not like everybody's going to rip out their cabinets or scrape their walls and remove all of the paints and wallpapers and glues and top. I mean, you can't. So buildings, to me, are a bigger problem, because we're trapping these things inside. We spend 80 to 90% of our time indoors. And so the air quality inside a building. Well,
you might spend 80 to 90% of your time indoors.
Well, not you.
I don't.
But a normal human being that's not you spends 80, 90% of their time indoors, and the air quality is up to 10 times more toxic indoors just because it's trapped.
It's crazy that you just think about this. 100 years ago, they weren't these unhealthy building problems. It's fascinating, actually, and part of it is I'm into the Deadwood series, so I'm like in season 2. So it takes place back in I don't know, the 1870s, 1880s, or whenever it was, when things were sort of more natural and just built with the material itself. So. Okay,
yeah, and back then, lead poisoning meant something entirely different.
Yeah, exactly. So 1950s was the big introduction of this petrochemical industry. Is that a formal term, petrochemical?
Yes.
Okay.
And so it caused an explosion and a revolution, and really fueled all of the growth and progress and innovation that America felt. It positioned us as a superpower, really, because of that. Because it all stemmed from this, the innovations that the petrochemical revolution brought us, which you could say a lot of them were good things. But what we didn't realize back then, and what we now know, is that we've essentially been toxifying ourselves since. So the birth of the environmental movement essentially parallels the growth of the petrochemical industry. And I'm not even talking climate change and carbon emissions. I'm just talking purely from a health standpoint. So by 1962, a very pivotal book came out called Silent Spring by Rachel Carson. And that book is pinpointed as the birth of the modern environmental movement, because it chronicles the toxins that we were dumping into our environment, into our air, and into our water.
So if this dumping in the majority say happened in the 50s, so only 10, 12 years later, somebody or people are already aware of what we were doing to our environment.
Right. We started noticing the health effects immediately, but think about the normal process that goes on. Hey, I think that this lead paint might be causing health issues. And the paint industry says, no, it isn't.
Right.
Well, I think it is. We'll prove it. And so the burden of proof has always been that you're innocent until proven guilty. So the industries themselves didn't want to admit any wrongdoing, obviously, even if they knew it was wrong. So it took a dozen years just for the environmentalists to start forming and sharing notes and realizing lead paint really took off in the 1950s, and the health effects were felt immediately. And it wasn't until 1989 that we officially banned it. And even though we stopped using lead paint almost entirely by the early 80s, we officially banned it in 89, almost on ceremony, because nobody was using it by then. There's still 300,000 children every year that are affected by lead paint poisoning to this day.
Is it really?
So it's this persistent chemical because we painted everything with it.
Everything with it.
And the same thing with asbestos, right? By the 1960s, the asbestos workers who were installing the insulation and then the tiles and everything, they started all having lung issues. And it took a while to figure out what the cause was and pinpoint it. And by the 1970s, asbestos was virtually dead. I remember in 75 or 76, they closed our school so they could remove the asbestos that was in the school. And even though we felt the health effects in the 60s, stopped using it entirely in the 70s, we didn't officially ban it until the 80s. And again, almost as a matter of ceremony, that it wasn't, nobody was really using it by then.
Well, what's interesting.
So the ban came at the end, not at the beginning. That's what's interesting about it.
Yeah, the ban comes at the end, but now there's still a whole bunch of buildings that have it. So the ban meaning we can't use it anymore, but now there's still a whole bunch of buildings have it. That even today, that we have to deal with, even as architects today, especially older buildings, East Coast. You probably have lead in lead paint in those buildings, and you have to properly remediate it. You can't just go in there and remove it. A company has to come in, or you encapsulate it, or whatever it is. But you can't disturb that stuff, and it's really the health effects of the children, are important. Which is, it's crazy that there's still that many kids today that get that lead poisoning.
So it's not even and lead and asbestos, they're already banned, they're already illegal. Everybody already knows they're terrible, and we already have ways to abate them, and so we look out for them. Those aren't the chemicals that bother me. If anything, those are the success stories because we actually followed through and banned them. To me, it's the 80,000 chemicals that are found in a typical home or a typical office that bother me. And it's all the health trends that show, like for instance, in the 1960s, a woman's lifetime risk of breast cancer was only 1 in 20, and today it's 1 in 8.
What year was that? 1 in 20?
From the 1960s, 1 in 20.
Wow.
And today, 50 years later, it's 1 in 8. And so I've got all these awful graphs that all just shoot upward, and they're all very depressing, and it's all tied to chemical toxin exposure. And so in 1962, Rachel Carson's book, Silent Spring, kicked this off. By 1970, the drumbeat was so loud that 75% of Americans called themselves environmentalists, believe it or not, in the 1970s,
wow,
which would be unheard of today. And President Nixon founded the Environmental Protection Agency. launched Earth Day, the Clean Air Act, the Clean Water Act, all in 1970. By 1971, he signed a Cancer Act and formed the President's Cancer Panel, which is still in existence to this day. President Obama has really doubled down on cancer research.
Which is interesting, just to paint the picture here. Obviously, Nixon was a Republican back in the 70s, 71. The stuff he did then would not be typically on a typical Republican agenda these days.
No, but Republicans are the party of conservation. They wanted to conserve the environment. That's what the true Republican Party was about. They were the first environmentalists, not the Democrats. And it's amazing how Reagan's Southern strategy throughout the 70s and 80s reversed that idea. And so by 1976, spearheaded by Nixon, but at that point it was President Ford, signed the Toxic Substances Control Act, or TSCA as it's called. That piece of legislation was the only successful piece of legislation the federal government ever really passed for controlling toxins. Unfortunately, the chemical industry had lobbied Congress to neuter it. And so it put the burden of proof on the Environmental Protection Agency, on the EPA. The EPA would have to prove that it's toxic before it could get banned. Right. And as a result, the EPA they can only review about 5 chemicals a year. They've only, in 40 years, they've only banned 5 chemicals in that 40-year period.
Wow.
But 1,500 new chemicals come out every year. So this TSCA Act, Toxic Substances Control Act, isn't working. And just last week, and this is why I wanted to talk about this, just last week the House voted to revise and update TSCA. And so it was a landmark legislation. It's great that they did it, but unfortunately the chemical industry has again lobbied Congress, and they snuck in provisions into the revision of TSCA that kind of neuter the ability of states to do stuff, which is unfortunate.
So it's a little bit, as far as these chemical companies are concerned, it's still a little bit of the wild, wild west. They get to kind of do whatever they want, and leave it on the burden of the EPA to prove that whatever they just released is dangerous.
And remember, the EPA funding keeps getting cut every year, and one of the Republicans' goals, Donald Trump said that he will abolish the EPA in his first 100 days in office, which, by the way, the president can't really do. But it's nice that he says that, I guess, and people cheer, but it would be devastating to your health if that were to happen. And not that I want to get so political here, but there's a lobby called the American Chemistry Council, or the ACC. Last year alone, they spent $55 million lobbying Congress. They're one of the largest lobbies for Congress. It's about $100,000 per congressman is what they kind of spend.
Wow.
It's amazing amounts of money. They represent 150 different companies: Dow, DuPont, Monsanto, ExxonMobil. All the oil companies are members of the American Chemistry Council. All the chemical industry, of course, is members, but even a lot of the food producers, because they put oil chemistry into the food.
So what's interesting to me, well, there's a lot of interesting stuff, but that Nixon, could be the president that was credited with the environmental movement and some of the stuff that he was doing. I didn't realize that. Yeah,
he totally is. He really kicked it off. Remember, it was a weird time because in 1970, the river in Cleveland, the Cuyahoga River in Cleveland, caught fire. It was so polluted. The river caught fire.
Because they were dumping all of their sludge and chemicals and factory stuff, whatever.
Right,
wow.
And so that kicked off the Clean Water Act, which kicked off the Clean Air Act, which kicked off... and there was a giant oil spill in 1969 off the coast of Santa Barbara. And so oil was washing up on the beach. So there were all these terrible things that were happening. And Nixon, he really became our first environmental president.
That's crazy. So if the whole Watergate thing didn't go down, he probably would have been remembered in a much more positive light in the environmental movement.
Yeah.
Wow.
He also did cool things with China, if you remember. But
right.
Yeah, it's kind of a shame that he was such a weirdo.
And so was Reagan sort of the one who turned the tables?
Reagan was the anti-environmental president. So,
okay.
For example, President Carter put solar collectors on the roof of the White House. They were solar thermal, not PV, but they were solar panels on the roof of the White House. And Ronald Reagan took them down in his first 10 days in office. He said that they were unbecoming of the presidency.
Wow. And he was a big California guy, so that's interesting that he would take that stance. And
well, he also gutted all of the solar incentives that Carter had started. So he single-handedly killed the solar industry and set it back by decades.
Wow, that's interesting. All right, so then we have in 1980 we start to become aware of the sick building syndrome.
Yeah, we had this idea in the 80s that energy was cheap. And again, Ronald Reagan's president at this point. Energy is cheap, buildings are cheap. So the oil industry lobbied Congress for building codes to change and lobbied different states for building codes to change. And we started hermetically sealing up buildings where the windows didn't open to force conditioned air.
Right.
So they made these very energy-dependent buildings, which sounds great to an energy company, I guess, but what we didn't realize is people are gross. So people would come in and they'd have the flu and they'd sneeze and their sneeze would get trapped in the building and then everybody would get sick. Or worse, they'd have spores growing on the inside of ducts because no fresh air was ever allowed in. So you'd get these crazy molds and strains of viruses that would start growing in the building. And so you get this building where everybody would get ill right away or feel ill, almost like they have the flu. And so sick building syndrome became a real thing. It was on the cover of Time magazine in 1981. And we realized, oh yeah, we need fresh air to breathe. and so we kind of quickly reversed things. You then have states that started taking off. So California in 1985 introduced Prop 65, which controlled toxins in buildings. And that's, if you're ever in California and you see those crazy signs that, this building contains toxins known to be harmful, that's a 1985 law called Prop 65 that pushes for disclosure and transparency in what's in a building.
But doesn't, because we see those all over the place.
Doesn't ban them.
No, you can still go into the building,
Yeah, it's your choice to go into the building, I guess, but at least has to tell you and alert you that it's there.
So in 1989, you said that's when we banned essentially asbestos and lead paint.
Yeah, but again, after decades of health alarms and risks, and also a full 10 years after Europe did it, they were always kind of on the cutting edge. So for us, the bans always come after the fact, after nobody was using asbestos or lead paint by those points.
Yeah, it was probably 10 years. People weren't using it for the previous 10 years, but it took that long for the legislation to work itself through.
Right. And then since then, what you have is this just huge ramp up in the American chemical industry and fueled by the American Chemistry Council's lobbying efforts on Congress, just to push chemicals. And so what you have is you have all of these chemicals in a building. And so what we found is that these are persistent toxic chemicals. So you pass them on to your children. A mother passes them on through the womb to their children. So for instance, we found that in newborn babies, you figure they're fresh, they're brand new kids, that in their umbilical cord blood were 287 out of the 300 most toxic chemicals, including they found Teflon, Scotchgard, phthalates, endocrine disruptors already in your umbilical cord blood. So babies are not born with a fresh start. We're now giving birth to generations of people that are pre-toxified.
When did we start to discover that research?
That was in the last 10 years where we started realizing that breast milk contains 500 different toxins. And breast milk's still good for you, but the trouble is that we're toxified throughout our life. We didn't pass this on to our children.
Right. And if breast milk contains that many, I can't imagine what formula contains. But
exactly. And so phthalates are this very pernicious strain of chemicals that mimic hormones. So they fool your body into thinking of certain hormones. So that's why you've seen early onset menopause in older women. You've also seen early onset puberty in children. Why as early as 9 and 10, they're starting to trigger puberty because the phthalates are doing that. We have endocrine disruptors, which cause memory loss, trigger, it's the whole pathway towards Alzheimer's. And then, of course, the whole array of known carcinogens, cancer-causing chemicals that we've identified as cancer-causing, and you still use them anyway. Because remember, except, in the state of California, all you have to do is just tell people they're there, but none of them are banned. You're allowed to use anything you want except asbestos and lead paint.
So, we went up through the 90s. We learned from some of our mistakes. So here we are, 2016. You'd think, all right, we're on the upswing. We learn, we're healthier, and it seems like the last 25 years, the opposite has happened. Like, it's worse.
That's how people have been fooled. That people assume that if a product is sold, that it's safe.
Right.
Whether it's food or shampoo or flooring, it's safe. But the reality is that no one has tested it. No one's been really allowed to test it. And the companies refuse to disclose what's in it.
Right.
And because they'll say, especially if you say, what's in your carpet? They'll say, well, it's proprietary. It's our secret formula.
And
Go
by
away.
the way, you deal a lot with these manufacturers. And I mean, this is part of your gig over the last, several 200 years that you've been doing this.
Yeah, I fight with them constantly. Yes, exactly. And I'm gonna give you, at the end of this, we're gonna give you tips on how to get your manufacturers, your sales reps, to tell you more than they normally would.
So then, so you watch the documentaries. It was discouraging. What's been happening in the last 10 years seems like it's just setting us up to make it worse for the next, say, 10 years or 20 years. Like, it's not on the upswing. It's not like we're in this renaissance of a movement. Like, we realized all this because, these chemical companies, these manufacturers, they're controlling all of this. And it doesn't sound like they have our interest in mind.
No, no. They remember, they deal in volume. So if they can save 3 cents on a bottle of shampoo by putting in a more toxic chemical, that adds up to millions for them. So it's the health effects. They're not beholden to you; they're beholden to shareholders. That's just the reality of the system. So luckily, there's been this big push in the last 10 years where consumers have demanded transparency. And you've all experienced this, right? You've all bought organic food. You've all looked at nutrition labels. You've all asked, what's in this? Is it healthy for me? But you need to realize food you put in your mouth and you ingest. But building materials, you absorb through your nose, lungs, and skin, and you ingest. You're eating building materials, right? When you're touching surfaces, you're transferring those chemicals just as much. When you're breathing in a toxic indoor air quality, you're eating them. So we don't think of them the same way, but the truth is we are ingesting those chemicals, and they're getting into our body and our bloodstream the same way. And regulation is failed us. It's been very slow and always after the fact. And now what you have is you have most manufacturers have 2 versions of their product. They have the version they sell to the Europeans, which is highly regulated, and their transparency laws are incredible.
Yeah, we have and there's a lot we can learn from the European market like that and the regulations, and for some reason we just don't. Well, the reason being is the manufacturers probably lobby Congress to not.
Exactly, that's the difference. So a typical Chinese manufacturer, let's say a flooring, will have the EU version, which is healthy and formaldehyde-free, and then they have the cheap toxic version they sell to the U.S. market.
That's
and they
crazy.
like that version because they make more money off of it.
That's crazy.
And so one of the things that I do is I work with manufacturers to try to actually figure out, does it cost you money to maintain 2 separate product lines? And sometimes it does, and I can make an argument that just make them all healthy.
Right.
Right? Don't differentiate. IKEA does that, for instance, right? They had to meet European standards, and they thought, you know what, this is crazy. It's costing us more money to have 2 different versions, so we'll give the Americans the healthy one too.
Right. Now,
it wasn't out of altruism. I mean, it ended up saving the money, but
it was a business decision.
Yeah, but a good one. And so, and the sad part is, this is not really a secret. Any architects or interior designers that you talk to that deal in this building health issue, we all know this. It's all common knowledge to all of us. And so that's kind of the sad part. When I have to tell my students this, they look crestfallen. It looks like I told them that Santa Claus doesn't exist in a way, because they know that can't be. If they sell the materials, they must be healthy. That's their thinking, but it's not.
Well, it is. It's that sort of being naive about the building industry and wanting to trust the manufacturers, because it's like, well, if they're offering this to us, it must be safe.
But just to give you a sense of how bad things are, the Food and Drug Administration, the FDA, they're the ones that regulate food. Their guidelines haven't changed since they were enacted in 1938.
Interesting.
So, is it 80 years? Their guidelines have not changed. Despite all that we know about chemistry and science and nutrition, their guidelines have not changed, and that's been a result of the lobbying industry.
So, and it seems like a lot of the problems, much like let's say our buildings, right? Where architects a lot of times we're working with existing buildings. It's not often it's necessarily new construction. We usually have to work with some capacity of an existing building. It's like you said earlier about the test recently showing the baby born with the umbilical cord blood already has all these toxins in it. So it's as architects, we're already working with an existing building that has these toxins. It's like, what do we do? It's like we're already behind the 8 ball. Even we have the best intentions of moving forward, but we're already behind the 8 ball. Like, we don't get a fresh start.
Well, that's the good news. So that's what's been driving this push towards what we call transparency. If regulations are not going to require manufacturers to do this, at least architects and designers can demand this and demand that manufacturers be transparent with what's in their product. And the green, it started with the green or sustainable materials first, because obviously they want to brag that they have healthy materials. So they were the first to go transparent. But this has kind of forced the hand of all these other manufacturers to be transparent about this. So we call this whole field, by the way, we call this life cycle assessment, or LCA. This kind of looking at the whole life of the product. What's it made from? What are the byproducts of making it? What happens when you dispose of it or throw it away? And so today we have this thing called an Environmental Product Declaration, or EPD. And the EPD essentially says, here's the impact of this material, here's what's in it, here's how toxic it is. Now, the amazing part is, with life cycle assessment or environmental product declarations, it's not a guarantee that it's healthy. All it's about disclosure, it's transparency. It's basically just saying, here's what's in it, so you, Mr. and Mrs. Designer, you can make an informed decision.
And this is voluntary.
So far, it's voluntary, but luckily there's now thousands of manufacturers that are willing to disclose what's in it, and there's lots of programs, right? The new version of LEED, the Green Building Rating System, for instance, is very heavily dependent on environmental product declarations. Okay. And we're going to talk about that in another podcast. The Living Future Institute, which is the Living Building Challenge folks, they have their own version called Declare, where manufacturers can declare what's in it. It's not a guarantee of health. It's just tell us what's in it. Does it have cancer-causing chemicals? Yes or no. Does it have phthalates? Yes or no. So every manufacturer it doesn't need to be healthy. Every manufacturer could declare their product, and I wish they would.
What's interesting though is it's not so much marketing strategy for them. It's basically, giving us more information so as architects and designers we can make better decisions. But the ones who have the better product are the ones who are going to sell more product.
Right, that's the idea. So manufacturers are scared of this because they're afraid that they might be admitting guilt or liability. But the truth is that transparency always leads to better things. That's really the truth. I have two great stories. One is there's a carpet company called Mohawk Carpet. You guys have probably specified or used their carpet in your projects. They have committed to declaring all of their product lines. So all of their carpets are declared.
Wow.
And the amazing part is when they started doing this, they learned things about their own carpet they didn't know. And so they've transformed their company. Their product roadmap has changed because of this push towards transparency. So they committed to do this because they thought it was the right thing to do, but then they realized what they're learning from the process, and so they've fundamentally changed how they make their carpet. And they've now built a Living Building Challenge showroom, and they've gone really nuts with it. It's been amazing. So that's Mohawk Carpet. And then the second one is a company called Proseco, which is a waterproofing company. They wanted their product to be installed on the Bullitt Center, which is a Living Building Challenge building. The architects, Miller Hull as the architects, had said to them, well, unfortunately, we can't use your waterproofing because it contains phthalates, and we're not allowed to use phthalates under Living Building Challenge. And the Proseco folks, to their credit, said, well, what if we can change the formula? And they did.
Wow.
And as a result, all of their waterproofing now is phthalate free. Because
all of it.
All of it. Because one project was enough to kind of alert them that this was an issue. And once they learned what phthalates are and how bad they are, the president of the company, who's a great guy, said, how can I knowingly leave this in, knowing what I now know? How can I sleep at night? And so transform the chemistry of their entire product line to do so. And of course it's paid off. So they have a better product, a healthier product, and they're doing the right thing.
What was that company again?
Proseco.
So it's interesting because you think about, we're advanced, right? We're a very advanced society. There's all kinds of research going on at the university level. These manufacturers have their own research departments. You would think that we know enough now that we could do our formulas, example, this waterproofing company, that they could do a little bit of research, spend some R&D money, and figure out how to take out these toxic chemicals and still have their product be viable like this waterproofing company did. It's just the other manufacturers. I don't know if they're necessarily lazy, or I don't know what it is.
Well, they're a lot of them don't know. So
maybe they just don't know.
I meet with a lot of sales reps, and so there's 6 questions I want to give everybody, and we'll have these on the website and the show notes too. But I want you to ask these 6 questions every time a sales rep comes to your office and shows you anything: carpet, flooring, wallpaper, whatever it is. It doesn't matter. Ask them these 6 questions. They might not know the answer to all of them. In fact, they probably don't. But
actually, I want to press before you get into the 6. I want to ask just one question first before you get to 6. Do you have an appointment? Because I hate when they show up unannounced.
Me too. I hate that.
I just want to update your materials library. Can I just come in for a second? I just don't like that.
I hate it. I absolutely hate it. Yeah. If they don't have an appointment, I used to, when they would just walk in, I would go, no, I can't see you now. Just even if I could see them, I wouldn't see them, just on principle. So every product that you look at, you got to ask yourself these 6 questions and ask them of the sales reps. And basically, it's, where did this material come from? What's it made of? 2, what are the byproducts of making it? 3, how is it delivered or installed? So is it coming from China? Is it coming from the town next door? And when it's installed, are you covering it with toxic chemicals, or is it going in as is? Do I have to paint it? 4, how is it maintained or operated? Does it need to be plugged in? Do I need to paint it every 3 years? Does it, does it require constant effort? 5, how healthy is it? Which is a very open-ended question, but just, is it off-gassing? Is it toxic? And then finally, number 6, what do we do with this thing when we're done with it? Because a lot of companies will tell you, put it in the landfill, which is not an acceptable answer, because a lot of these products, like vinyl, for instance, when it's in the landfill, it breaks down and releases arsenic gas. So we're throwing this in the landfill and essentially poisoning ourselves at the same time. So you ask those 6 questions, and like I said, they probably don't know the answer to some of them, but push them. They want your sale, so make them work for it.
Well, I like the last point, and we've talked about this before, is, what happens when the life of this product is over. And you said, it just goes to landfill, and you're saying, well, that's not acceptable anymore. So we as consumers, or the architect as designer, it's like, no, that's not an acceptable answer, because it seems like a lot of these products don't have to go to the landfill.
No, a lot of them, there's a countertop company I work with. They'll pay to ship back the old countertop when you're done with it.
Interesting.
And they'll grind it up, and they have a whole product line that they'll make out of the regrind, it's called. And it's it has a kind of a mottled, recycled look to it, but they're making more product out of it. So at least they're not downcycling, they're not upcycling, they're just kind of recycling. But at least it doesn't end up in a landfill. It's being put to use.
And then if of those 6 questions that you asked, and I think they are important, would a good sales rep from a good company, would they know all of those? Or should they know all of those?
They should know all. Any sales rep should, but most don't. But if you're dealing with a green company, there's a company called AFM Safecoat. They make this line of zero VOC paints. Their sales reps know every answer to this, right?
Right.
There's thousands of companies that I've gotten to work with that know these answers inside and out. They're green companies, but for traditional companies, you might be the first one to ever ask them that. In fact, they usually end up saying that. Nobody's ever asked me that before.
Right.
Yeah, well, it's important, so go find out and come back to me. And so I give them homework. I use these questions to have them educate themselves, because I don't have time to do the research and all this stuff. You tell me what's in it, and so they have to come back to me with answers if they want my sale.
Right. That makes sense. Did you ever get their salespeople, but they're peddling different products, so they try and get your time, and they'll show you like 10 different products at once?
Oh yeah.
What are those people?
Well, they're hedging their bets, I think. Like there's a guy in San Francisco. He's the flooring guy, and he represents a vinyl flooring company. So he's got like a resilient floor. He represents a commercial carpet, a residential carpet. Like he's got one of every. He's like a Noah's Ark guy.
Right.
He's got one of everything in his handbag. And he's like, "What do you need? I'm the flooring guy. You got flooring?
Right.
I got a solution for you." But he only has one company from each.
Okay.
So he doesn't compete, I guess. But it's his way of kind of representing 10 companies at once.
The one I used to hate is, and I would occasionally even get it now, is the quick phone call. Hey, I'm at an architect's, office down the hall. Can I come see you? Or they knock on my door. Hey, I'm in the neighborhood. It drives me nuts. No.
That's why I started putting our PO box address on the website,
right?
Because they'd try, like I showed up, but it's a PO box. Where's your office? None of your goddamn business, basically.
All right, we're over our 30 minutes. We're at 42 minutes, trying to keep these at 30. So how do we want to end this on, I guess, a positive note? Obviously, you watch the documentaries. It's depressing. And if we step back and look at this, the big picture, it is kind of depressing. It's not like it's kind of not like we're through the thick of it. Now we're on the upswing. Like we're still in the thick of it. The turning point hasn't happened yet. No, which is why it's really up to you. I use these 6 questions of all your sales reps, make them work for it a little bit, and then once they have the answers, invite them back for a lunch and learn. Let them say, okay, you come back with these 6 answers, and you can give a lunch and learn to the whole office, right? That's a good thing. You are their customer, so manufacturers do listen to you, and so you need to be the one to push them for transparency. It's really up to you. You can't wait for them to show up with a green product. There's this chicken and egg thing that happens where manufacturers say, well, the architects aren't asking for this, and the architects say, well, there's no green products available, and that kind of downward spiral just keeps going. So you break that cycle. Ask for them to be transparent with what's in their product and make it clear that this is important to you and to the firm. And it's interesting because I could, see how, let's say I'm an employee and I'm in a small 6-person firm. I mean, how am I going to affect, like, how does that matter? How does my decisions matter? If I'm pressing these manufacturers. But if you take that and the attitude, and if everybody starts to do it, it definitely matters. And there's very big architectural firms, corporate firms that do have voices and can really influence, I think, the manufacturers and how they do their stuff. Yeah, but I'd argue the small firms are they've always been the early adopters and the first movers when it's come to sustainability. If you're in a small, as you say, a 6-person firm, you're probably more likely to be the first one they've heard this from. Yeah. The big firms might be so big that they might not think it's important, or they might assume it's somebody else's problem. So don't assume that it falls on the big firms to do it. There's rare cases, but typically the big firms they're not known for their sustainable leadership. They're known for making money. Yeah, they're definitely not the early adopters. You're right about that. And that gives us a chance, those of us at small firms, to be the early adopters. And the thing is, it's doing our work better, becoming better architects, becoming a little more environmentally conscious. But also, we have to pick materials anyway. We have to pick flooring. We have to pick paint. So, it's on us. Let's pick the best stuff we can. Exactly.
So that's why you want to ask these questions of everything you put into it.
Alrighty, I think that's going to wrap up this page turner of an episode. Actually, I think it was fascinating in terms of the. It's fascinating to me in terms of where we started eons ago and where we were till about the 1950s, and then where we've been really the last 60, 70 years. And hopefully we can start turning the corner. We have to. We have to. Alrighty, my name is David Doucette on behalf of Eric Corey Freed. This is the ARE Podcast.
Thanks for listening to the ARE Podcast. Be sure to visit architectexamprep.com and check out our other podcast episodes, video tips, and the ARE blog. Remember to plan, practice, and pass.